Are we good to go, Miriam?
Good to go.
Very good. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My colleague, Chris Gdak, and I are very pleased to be with you and very much appreciate C-Clear and CalEPA DTSC for allowing us this conversation together regarding some of the most important topics we have today pertaining to redevelopment, and that is brownfield development. In our approach today, what we hope to do, Chris and I, is to have a relaxed, informal conversation regarding the best approach to redevelopment. And then we would like to focus on practical challenges, actual tested challenges that we have faced during the time of redevelopment on significant projects throughout the state of California. And then we will conclude with a discussion about probably one of the most important topics, and that is funding. Chris will take us through the funding discussion. And as we go into the discussion, our primary focus will be how to ensure a profitable, feasible, approvable, and constructible project. For us and for us collectively, making certain that the projects are actually implementable is key. And so that is always our end in sight. That is our focus. To begin with, I think we can all acknowledge that if it's not for the public-private partnership that we collectively have together, where our public servants are the custodians of the public trust coming together with the private entities so that we can together, private and public, create that partnership that can drive and build our communities in a sustainable and resilient way. We see today what is happening to the state of California regarding fires and other items. And we recognize together that private-public partnership is really a relationship that is not adversarial in nature. To the contrary, it is complementary in nature. And to that, allow me to really salute our public servants who have been true custodians of public trust in ensuring that we are moving forward with our communities. So let's get right to it now. To us, redevelopment or brownfield development is truly a dream deferred. It's a pro forma driven development that is there to quantify and implement a path forward that, one, maximizes revenue, and two, decreases cost. So we are always looking for ways and paths to get a project approved in a manner so that we decrease risk, liability, and increase value. And it all has to be monetized. No idea can exist in the real world if it's not monetized, if it cannot be quantified into a path that can be assessed and can be realized and can be made into reality. And the only way to do that is to be pro forma driven. So everything that we do is pro forma driven. And everything that we do is about maximizing revenue and decreasing cost, limiting risk and liability. To do that, the initial steps that we follow and we suggest that is a best practice for redevelopment is really a three-step approach, where initially we begin with a site financial and development model, where we would quantify and model the way the site is today physically and institutionally in terms of all the approvals that it has and the approvals that it requires, and then look at the site physically where it needs to be. Then we look at the allocation of responsibility, and then we quantify if there is a gap. So for a site financial model, site financial and development model to be real, it means we need to take all the due diligence data that we've collected, turn it into information, but most importantly, turn the information into quantifiable, monetized values that can enter the pro forma either through the phases of the project and through the finance or the burn rate of the project. That is critical. So we create that model in order to understand the path of how the project will proceed. In the second step, we now look at, now that we've identified all the critical items, the critical input parameters, be it constraints, be it risk factors, whatever that may be it soil, groundwater, vapor, institutional engineering controls, operation and maintenance. We look at that, and now the relationship between the buyer and a seller in a transaction, as well as an agency that is overseeing that particular redevelopment, could be a municipality, a city, or a county, or perhaps a public agency such as a state agency. Now there's an allocation of responsibility. So is a buyer now responsible for some of the exposures on the environmental, or is that related to the responsible party? Once that allocation is clarified through the various instruments between the parties, then we enter that into the final model, which is there a gap, a financial gap, to make the project pencil? And you'll hear me say that quite a bit. Projects must pencil. They must make sense. Otherwise, nobody would do them. Regulators are there to assist in, one, protecting the environment and public health, but also ensuring that we are moving forward with sustainable and resilient communities. But in order to do that, the public and private together need to make certain that those projects do in fact pencil. They can be monetized, they can be profitable, and communities can celebrate them. So that that montage of a dream deferred can be real and can be enjoyed by all. So that model then that we create really looks at the gap, the financial gap that is needed to bring the project from red to black. That is a critical concept. And we create that model. Typically, if a site is large enough that is composed of multiple parcels, it'll be a function of each parcel. It'll be a function of soil, groundwater, vapor, topography, current fill, so on and so forth. And in order to get it to a point now where we are moving from the due diligence, from the overall model of the project to actual development activities, the first critical item that must be considered, and that actually comes way early on in the process, and that is, to what extent is this particular site going to be cleaned, restricted or unrestricted cleanup? In all cases, well, in most cases, unrestricted cleanup, that means I can go grow my tomatoes in the backyard. My kids can roll in the sand. There are no issues with the site. It's pristine. That is typically prohibitive cost-wise. There are sites that can attain that, but in many cases, in brownfields, especially industrial sites, that can be prohibitive. So a lot of the sites are restricted. When they are restricted, and as they get certified, they come with land use covenants, deed restrictions, that come with institutional controls, engineering controls, and we'll talk about some of those, O&M, inspections. Well, when we do that in the early stages of the project, it's important, as we recognize and identify these items, we also monetize them to the extent possible, so that they can, and not only monetize them, but allocate them relative to the phase of the project, so that we understand when that cost can be incurred and when the requirement is triggered by regulators. Moving away now from the concept of the project, now that we've constructed the project, Now let's look at the team to implement. So you notice we're going from the overall approach now to the team, and then we're going to get into some of the issues. So the team to implement, typically, let's say in a vertical project, typically there are really three specific teams: the owner's team, the architect, the design team, and then the contractor. Well, the owner's team is providing the base information, is informing the site relative to the constraints, the regulations. What are the key aspects of the site, the features, environmental, geotechnical. The designer takes the base information and now is providing the best options for design within the constraints and within the approvals that exist. Well, then comes the general contractor that is implementing that design. Here is a key concept that we found to be extremely important. At no point can we de-link the owner's team from the architect's team from the general contractor. And the reason is, if they are de-linked and if there's something missed in the process, which we will address in a minute, then you're open to redesign, potential construction bust, and potential claims, or potentially not able to get the approval that is needed to move forward. So those three teams constitute the anchors, the legs of that stool that would allow the project to stand. As we move into the design, and we go through, again, I'm focused on vertical design here rather than horizontal design, infrastructure. And the same applies to horizontal. But as we move into the design, schematic design typically is looked at as, well, we're not really tying down the project. This is just ideas. And we look at it in more details at DD, design development stage. At brownfield development, all disciplines must come together all the way up to concept, from the beginning, from schematic design all the way into DD, CD, and then construction. And the reason is that, here's an example. Take MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing. If there's a vapor barrier that hugs the site, creating that hermetic seal, and the MEP folks are in the schematic design are working hard at their design, but yet not realizing that all the penetrations through the barrier are going to create significant challenges for the approval and potentially for the construction. Now we may have redesign or potentially a construction problem. So having it right from the beginning, same applies for structural, same applies for geotechnical, the type of piles where they exist. When we catch them as schematic design, and then a design development, they're appropriately implemented, and then we issue construction documents that are specific to that design that included all disciplines, we would do much better than if they were isolated. So some of the design parameters that would need to be considered from the get-go so that we can appropriately evaluate where we need to be and make sure that, one, the project pencils, and two, that it is approvable and constructible, are issues like cleanup goals. If it is a restricted site, is it being cleaned up to residential standards, commercial standards, or industrial? Are there subterranean spaces, subterranean garage? Are we approaching groundwater in any way? What type of open space and parks do they require barriers? Do they require import soil? What type of foundations? These are some of the key items that are caught early on during the schematic design phase in order to see if the project would actually pencil or if there are challenges that may need a further discussion either with regulators and or the engineering and construction team. So let's look at some tools that we would use to get the discussion from a concept stage to actual reality. So here's an example of a potential model, if you will, where we would take a site and we would take all the items that are associated with that site, be it soil, groundwater, vapor, underground storage tanks, above ground storage tanks, pits, any issues that encumber the site, the encumbrances of the site, and then we look at who is responsible, where it exists, at what stage of development does this parcel trigger activity for that particular site, or when are the regulators requiring remediation or some resolution for this particular feature. We would actually model that and we would monetize it and then allocate the responsibility, be it to the RP, the responsible party, the PRP, potentially responsible party, or a developer that has nothing to do with the original presence of that feature. And then once we model it and we create that cost model, that burn rate, we would then be able to define when, at what point can we leverage remediation to development, and at what point does an additional cost is an additional cost triggered, and or how can we minimize an impact? So that's a tool that can be extremely helpful. Here is another tool that I would suggest is very helpful to all development. In order for us to be able to quantify how sites are actually done or how they behave, we look at the site in terms of its topography. So here are some definitions. Topography T1. T1 is the site today, exactly as it is. T2 is the site as how a regulator would love to see it. What would a regulator need to unlock the site? That's T2. T3 is where a master developer would take the site. So you take it from beyond remediation now to development. And you can add a T4 for an end user. Why is that important? Because there's a cost for going from T1 to T2, T2 to T3, T3 to T4. The beauty of brownfield development when it's done right is that we can actually, in many cases, we can overlap these costs. If the site is designed appropriately, a cut and fill could serve both topographic changes needed for cut and fill, say maybe a fill for a roadway or a cut for a vertical development that can also serve the site in terms of its cleanup and removal of impacted soils. So that concept, when it is monetized and it's scheduled, is placed on a schedule, it becomes a critical tool. So let me go through very quickly some real examples of some of the challenges that we find at redevelopment sites. One example would be stormwater. If we do overland flow, does overland flow carry contaminants to surface waters? Is stormwater moving into DIs that are separate or combined with sanitary sewer? Are we mounding impacted groundwater? The SWIP during construction, is that SWIP taking into account what happens to exposed soils that are now seeing ponding water from stormwater? All of these relate to the type of permits that are associated with stormwater management before construction, during construction, and post-construction. Take wet and dry utilities. We've all known, and now we all know about vapor intrusion and vapor freight and transport. Well, today, our wet and dry utilities have to be handled in a special manner if they are preferential pathways for vapor intrusion. Well, if they are going to be handled in that manner, are they creating barriers? Are they creating constraints, boundary conditions that change the performance of a soil vapor extraction? So that means that all the design team, from remediation to design to construction, are to be aware of the impact of these mitigation measures. Foundation types. Are they penetrating a vapor barrier? Are they penetrating different layers of confining layers for groundwater, creating potential for cross-contamination? Are they opening up the site for potential changes in the freight and transport of groundwater, thus the developer now stepping in the responsible party position under CERCLA? That is something that you would think about during drilling, pile driving, foundation design, the type of these of foundations that we would put forward at a given site. And then finally, another example, waterproofing. Are waterproofing compatible with the groundwater contaminants that exist? How do they combine with vapor barrier? The two may not be necessarily compatible with each other. To what extent is groundwater being assessed? Are we looking at the historic high or the average? These items in a brownfield are critical because they allow us to contain and allow us to bracket, to bookend the different variables and make certain that the project can in fact be, can pencil and it is approvable and constructible. And as I close the discussion on the practicality of the site, there's probably one single item that is more important than anything else, and that is good old funding. And Chris will help us through that discussion. Chris?
Thank you, Elias. One of the primary challenges, as Elias has described, of brownfield redevelopments is how to cover the costs associated with the environmental site assessments, cleanup, abatement of lead and asbestos, demolition, site preparation, and the infrastructure improvements necessary to support new land use. That's where funding programs come into play, where we leverage grants, loans, and redevelopment incentives to help make deals pencil in the black. Sounds easy enough, right? Well, if you break it down into individual funding needs and opportunities, the complexity vanishes as funding gaps are eliminated. Here are a few examples of successful brownfield redevelopment projects throughout California. In Sacramento, redevelopment of the rail yards is transforming 240 acres of historic industrial property into a mixed-use extension of the city's central business district. Development of a comprehensive funding program that adapts to changing needs over time is key for a large, complex, multi-phase, multi-year project of this magnitude. In particular, significant funding is needed to achieve the demolition and cleanup phases and the vast infrastructure improvements necessary to prepare the site and attract private interest of developers who will provide the funding for the development phase. If you look hard enough into the rendering on the right, you can almost hear the cheers of the Sacramento Republic, Major League Soccer fans in the distance cheering on the celebrated brownfield redevelopment project. Moving over to Richmond, California. In the city of Richmond, the Community Foundation has partnered with city, local, state, and federal agencies to develop a $10 million funding program to support the revitalization of dozens of abandoned inner city properties into affordable homes for first-time buyers. The Richmond Housing Renovation Program is leveraging social impact bonds from the Mechanics Bank to help with property acquisition, demolition, construction activities. These bonds are then leveraged with EPA assessment grants, which are being used to complete due diligence to acquire the properties and then conduct RBM surveys and phase 2 environmental site assessments necessary to plan for cleanup and abatement. Then an EPR RLF grant obtained by the city is available to complete cleanup and abatement activities. And finally, last but not least, the California Energy Commission grant is helping the program incorporate energy efficiency matters necessary to meet the advanced zero net carbon standard for new construction. Sometimes brownfield redevelopment success is best measured in smiles, and this photo tells you the rest of what you need to know about this incredible landmark program. Finally, in Fresno, over the past 5 years, the city has secured multiple state and federal grants in an effort to revitalize downtown, Chinatown, and the Southwest Fresno neighborhoods. In 2015, an EPA area-wide planning grant was used to engage with stakeholders and develop a common vision, revitalization plan, and strategy. The big one was a $66.5 million Strategic Growth Council Transformative Climate Communities grant, which has been critical for the acquisition of property, permitting, and construction of catalyst projects, capital improvements necessary to attract investments. Finally, an EPA assessment grant and revolving loan fund grants obtained in the last 2 years are offsetting public and private costs to assess and clean up priority brownfields in these areas. There's so many exciting things happening in downtown Fresno, it could fill up an entire session. In case you're interested on how to get your project into the funding game, here's an update on some current funding opportunities in the state of California. The 2021 annual EPA Brownfield grant competition was announced 5 to 6 weeks earlier than usual this year. Assessment, cleanup, and multi-purpose grant applications are due at the end of next month, and many of us are currently preoccupied with those. Last month, the Prop 68 groundwater treatment and remediation program administered by the State Water Resources Control Board reported that there had been lower than anticipated demand and recommended policy changes to attract interest and allocate unencumbered funding. As a grant and funding hunter, those words pique your interest. So there's still some funding available through that program, and potential uses have been expanded. Next, one of the impacts of COVID has been an impact to the Strategic Growth Council Transformative Climate Communities Grant Program and their funding sources, and that has caused a delay in round 4 of funding, and something to keep your eye on. But it's not all bad news on the grant funding front. The Economic Development Administration Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act, is currently providing $1.5 billion of funding to support economic development plans and strategies, RLF programs, infrastructure and innovation programs, and that funding is available on a rolling basis until it's gone. Next slide. One of the things that's on everybody's mind is the deadly impacts of this year's wildfire season. And we're all wondering how we can become more resilient and reduce the incidence and impact of future disasters. Well, there's good news. There's an increasing number of programs aimed at resiliency and pre-disaster mitigation versus recovery. One current example is FEMA's BRIC program, which presently has $500 million available for nature-based solutions that will reduce the vulnerability of infrastructure and communities to disasters. On behalf of Elias and myself, we'd like to thank you for your interest in our presentation. We'll now open this up for any questions that you might have in the time remaining for our session. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We can stop sharing now.
Ignacio has there's some questions in the chat window. I'll take the first one. What are the challenges in working with cities that have lost staff? Someone to push the pencils. That has been a big challenge this year. We're finding that communities need this funding to help recover from COVID-19 impacts and close stores and businesses all over town. But the challenge is their normal work lives and have been completely disrupted. They're not meeting in person. It's harder to gain approvals. And with home responsibilities, looking after kids, it's just harder than normal to take on additional responsibilities like going after grants and securing them. And so we haven't solved that riddle, but as consultants, it's our job to try and make things as easy on the communities that we think will benefit from these grants. So yeah, just doing our part to leverage our experience is the only solution I've come up with so far. Have you worked on any CARES applications? Yes, we just did one last week for Greater Spokane Incorporated. It's a EDA application for a couple $100,000 of funding to update their SEDS document, their comprehensive economic development strategy for the region. And those applications are easier than EPA Brownfield grant applications, has been our experience. And you get great support from the EDA in pitching the programs and got good guidance along the way to submit an application that will most likely get funded. So that's been great.
So I see a question here regarding when do you work with vertical developers on major projects? Um, Typically, end users or vertical developers need assistance or need to understand the nature of the project or the constraints of the site right from the get-go, so that the design team can conceptualize a project that is appropriate for that site. So in our experience, we work typically with vertical developers very, very early. We either join the owner's team or the architect's team early on at the concept stage, if not at the schematic design stage. And we try to kind of create a rating of the parallel lines that exist for a particular project. Those parallel lines are the legal, the funding or the financial, the regulatory approval, and then, of course, the design and the construction. Those tend to kind of go in parallel rather than intersecting, but we call them the intersecting parallel so that they can inform each other and move forward through the phases in a manner that can be approvable and constructible. And that's very early on in the stages of the project.
Yeah, good afternoon. This is Ignacio. I might as well chime in. There are a couple more questions. So, Chris, did Stantec help Fresno with the TCC grant application in any way? And if you did, what role did you play in helping them with their application?
We came in, Ignacio, in 2018, just shortly after they had acquired the TCC. And so we looked to use that as the platform for their 2019 Coalition Assessment Grant that we assisted with, and then the RLF grant that we helped them get in 2020. So although we'd like to take credit for the big dollar item, the TCC, we didn't do that, but we did help leverage it to get some EPA funding added to the table.
And are there, you had mentioned EDA and TCC, which is more of the Strategic Growth Council. In California, what other grant programs are you really keyed in on that you think can be leveraged for some of these types of projects that you're seeing in the brownfields field?
Elias, do you want to talk about the recent stormwater grant application that you worked on?
Sure. There are funds available for addressing items related to infrastructure pertaining to enabling projects that are encumbered by nature to move forward. And some of that relate to stormwater management that maximize and protect the use of stormwater and prevent exacerbation of groundwater or the waters of the state. So we've gone through examples of that, and of course we await results, but that process is actually fairly interesting and exciting in the sense that it allows projects to showcase their ability, one, to reclaim the environment, the natural environment, as well as revitalize communities all at the same time.
Right.
And
go ahead. And as you mentioned also the wildfires, I think wildfires have been mentioned in practically every session today. And that will probably play a role in how cities do their planning, where they put their housing, where they put in, how they become more resilient. So are there any programs right now? I think you mentioned one, but are there any programs that you kind of jerry-rig so that you can help communities that are actually dealing with the aftermath of either preparing or getting more resilient against wildfires and or recovering from wildfires?
The FEMA BRIC program that I mentioned on our resiliency slide has been expanded to include wildfire measures. So that's kind of a new adjustment that was made to the program very recently. And then Ignacio, I think you're familiar with some case studies from the past of how EPA brownfield grants have been leveraged to help communities respond to floods and vacate large portions of the city. Vernonia, Oregon comes to mind. I'm unaware yet of somebody in California who has structured a brownfield assessment or cleanup grant around wildfire, but I'm sure it's on the horizon, and wouldn't be surprised to see it this year. In Southern Oregon, we're doing a coalition grant that includes 2 communities that have been impacted by wildfires in the last couple of weeks. So there's increasing opportunities for resiliency, and then there's programs that can be adapted to help with response.
Yes, actually, I'm not seeing any chats from the audience. Maybe my chat is disabled there, but I don't want to monopolize. I have so many questions for you. I mean, over the past 2 years, NGOs have been now eligible for some assessment grants to the EPA. And so are you seeing a shift in, or maybe actually expansion in the types of entities that are going after these assessment grants?
The Richmond Community Foundation project that I featured as one of my examples, that was a transition from the time when the city kind of had to apply on behalf of the community foundation to get the grant and then work with the NGO to utilize the funding. And the minute that assessment grants were opened up to nonprofits, we approached the community foundation and said, hey, not to cut out the city, but you're now eligible for your own grant, and this is a way to bolster, the amount of funding that the city and its partners can bring in. So there are some challenges with working with NGOs on programs and grant applications that have historic scoring that's been kind of adapted for city and county applicants, but we're finding ways to partner together through coalitions and help strengthen the resumes of NGOs to position them to have the high success rates that we hope for applicants. So yeah.
Okay, looks like here people are using the Whova chat to express their appreciation. So thanks to Chris and Elias. I think, maybe we should look at the Whova application. So I'm not on Whova now. Can someone from C-Clear check it out? And I have so many questions for Elias and Chris, but I'd like to give other people a chance to ask questions to Chris and Elias.
I'm not on Whova. Elias, are you?
I am trying to get there. I'm using my phone here.
Right, and actually, so another question, I guess, brownfields used to be, it started with the Rust Belt cities. Now, and then over the next few years, it became the very inner ring suburbs and the central cities. Are you seeing a difference in the kind of applicants who are also coming as far as geographically? Is it moving further out into the suburbs?
Yeah, I think you're aware, Ignacio, that the definition of brownfields is extremely broad. And that's one of the first conversations I have with communities is, I've talked to many 100,000 or more communities that say we don't have brownfields. And that's when I explain that it's any real property, that's vacant, underutilized, or undergoing transition and has some type of environmental obstacle to overcome to achieve funding or get financing or responsibly acquire a property. And so, yeah, I think for a long time, brownfields came with the image of a vacant, 20-acre industrial facility in the Midwest that had been shut down and had required millions of dollars to clean up. But the more you get into the broad definition of brownfields and explain how residential properties and empty lots can all qualify as brownfields, I think that explains a lot of the expansion and interest and success of programs out here on the West Coast that don't have the history or the the major abandoned factory type issues, but we all have a need to do in phase one environmental site assessments and regulated building materials surveys to responsibly reoccupy and acquire properties. So yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it.
So what is your most surprising brownfield that you found, and how both of you, how can you encourage those folks who have been hesitating to actually dive into these brownfields grants, and maybe perhaps they're missing out?
I'll go quick, and then maybe Elias, if you've got an answer to this one too. My most surprising brownfield was a park that I found doing a phase one that was called Brownfield Park, and it had nothing to do with it being named after Brownfield. There was a historic resident with the last name Brownfield, but when we looked into it, there were recognized environmental conditions on that property, even though it looked like a park, and the name Brownfield ultimately tipped us off to there might be something more to this. Elias, what's your most unique brownfield site?
Well, let me answer it a little differently. Let me make a prediction here at this conference. I will predict that the term brownfield within few years, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, will no longer exist. And the reason is, in my opinion, that all development that we are doing today in the metropolitan core are really infill and TOD, and whether it's multifamily or otherwise mixed use, are mostly impacted properties. So the days of us moving out into suburban settings and taking over ag land, those are not really continuing. What is happening is us revitalizing our downtown core. So I think the regulations and our approach to brownfield, it will overlap with infill and TOD development and mixed use development. And soon enough, I think the term brownfield will be more akin to how to get to smart cities, how to get to an exciting, vibrant metropolitan core. And all these regulations within for sustainability, resiliency, environmental, will come together in a much more comprehensive, holistic manner to create those sustainable communities that we all so desire and all so dream about. What is surprising to me and exciting is that almost every turn that I turn to, there is a brownfield development that is at the core of a community revitalization. And what is surprising is that us not seeing that value of these properties that can bring forward the amazing history. Rather than seeing a wrecking ball come, why not see a revitalization of these fantastic properties that carry the after years and bring in employment and excitement to our communities and be profitable and make the communities where they sit, make them the communities of the future for our children. To me, that is the most exciting part about brownfields. It is the tomorrow that we have, that we can build today.
With that, Elias just read my mind. Thank you so much. That was, thank you, Stantec, for supporting this conference. Chris and Elias for your presentation. We are at 4:01, and so we appreciate you again supporting us. The recordings will be available a few days after this. And I think any presentations you can also download, we'll be able to post on Whova. But with that, we are closing today. Thank you for a very successful day, everyone who attended. And again, to Chris and Elias. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, everyone. Thank you, Ignacio.